Hi, good morning. Thank you for being here. And Sean was just saying to me, Dr. Stewart, I think we can start on time for once. So thank you all for joining us today. And we're delighted to have our good friend Alan Rozanski back with us today to provide grand rounds. And as you will all know, he is the Director of Nuclear Cardiology and Cardiac Stress Testing, as well as being the Director of the Cardiovascular Fellowship and also the Chief Academic Officer for the Department of Cardiology, all here at Mount Sinai St. Luke's. Dr. Rozanski got his BA in Literature from Yale University and then his MD from Tufts, and completed most of his training, his internship, his residency, and his cardiology fellowship at Mount Sinai Hospital, and then completed his nuclear fellowship at UCLA in California. And in the years since then, has devoted his career to many important things, but probably most importantly in terms of his lecture and also in terms of who he is as a person, as a professional, thinking about human behavior and how that relates to health and how it relates to disease. Help us understand how to work with patients to lead lives that will allow them to achieve everything that they hope to achieve in their lives. More recently, he's focused on us and how we think about ourselves and our lives as professionals and as people, as members of families, and what we can do to protect ourselves and move forward in a way that's joyful and fulfilling in all aspects of our lives. And we're always happy to have Dr. Rozanski with us, and particularly today to talk about this very important topic. Alan, welcome.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. And, it is a pleasure to always be here. And I've been here 29 years, and Grand Rounds has always had a big tradition here at St. Luke's, and it's just a lot of fun to be part of it. Really, I toggle between two areas in medicine and cardiology. One, it's an area that I'm very passionate about, obviously cardiac imaging, and particularly from the point of view of risk stratification, clinical decision making. A lot of nuances about that, and that's what I talked about in terms of Grand Rounds last year. But there's this other part of me. I've been able to be part of a field called behavioral cardiology. It's a blossoming field. It's a very important field. I've never spoken on a topic of physician burnout before, but it is an exceedingly important topic. And as a program director, I'm naturally interested in it. And so I decided I would take this opportunity of a Grand Rounds really to put my own thinking together. And this talk, which has been formulated for the first time, I think will be very useful to all of us. As a start, let me notice and make point of the fact that the number of articles that are now appearing on burnout are a very large number. And in fact, at the recent American College meetings, it was remarked that one of the big crisis we now face is this issue of burnout. This has been the subject of many books now which have been written on physician burnout. It has been part of a lot of news coverage talking about the widespread problem of physician burnout, this epidemic, and we even have national surveys on this, yearly surveys now on physician burnout. One of the famous articles by Dr. Shanafeld, who's now the Chief Wellness Officer at Stanford, but his roots were at the Mayo Clinic, and that's where he did a lot of his initial work. This is a survey of multiple centers, and this slide has been widely shown to show that nearly 50% of doctors by 2011 were reporting at least one or more symptoms of burnout. And then there was a follow-up study published 3 years later where they showed that in that 3-year period, practically in all specialties, there had been an increase in burnout symptoms. And certainly this has been the subject of much investigation as to the causes of this. There are many leading candidates that are listed in this slide, and they deserve for sure a lot of consideration and investigation. So what is burnout? So this was initially put together by Christina Maslach and colleagues back in the 1970s. They were studying the service industry, and they came up with these observations that there were people who were suffering from emotional exhaustion, which is probably the most predominant symptom in terms of burnout, a sense of depersonalization in their work, and a decreased sense of accomplishment. And from this, a scale was developed, which is largely the scale that's used by most people to assess burnout. But the question is this valid? Is it important? What can we learn about it? So to give you a sense of where I've come in terms of my own direction with this, let me just mention a few things in terms of my travels. Back in the 1980s, I got interested in the effects of acute mental stress. I had no interest in psychology. I was interested in studying a new phenomenon at that time called silent myocardial ischemia. We were noticing on Holter monitors that patients were developing ST segment depression on Holters and during daily life activity at low heart rates without chest pain. And we didn't understand it, but we understood that besides exercise, other things were causing ischemia. So it became natural. I was working in this new field of nuclear cardiology. We came up with this project, and let's study patients during mental stress and exercise to understand the phenomenon of silent myocardial ischemia. So we set up a protocol, and working with the psychologists who told me, well, you have to use multiple stressors. We had patients, perform math tasks, a video game, and just merely speak on the personal stress in their lives. I said, okay, we'll do that. We'll do a mugger scan. We'll look at your cardiac function while you're talking and doing these tasks. And lo and behold, the second patient we do, which is shown in this slide from a paper I published in 1988, while this man, he's 59 years old, was speaking about the fact he was about to lose his job, he develops a little bit of ST segment depression. And when we look at the mugger study, lo and behold, he went from nearly normal wall motion to complete dyskinesis of the septum and dropped his ejection fraction by 20%. So this was an eye-opener. The fourth patient we did, nearly the same thing happened. We studied 40 patients. Half of them developed wall motion abnormalities during acute mental stress, just from talking about what was bothering them. And virtually none developed it during the other stressors. So this study, by the way, which has been reproduced now in about 50 studies, was one of those aha moments for me. I just could not walk away from this. Even though I was a nuclear cardiologist and I was doing imaging, this was just too fascinating. And it led ultimately to a sabbatical fellowship I got from the MacArthur Foundation to study the determinants of health-promoting and health-damaging behaviors. And this brought me into contact with a lot of people working in the behavioral field. And as a result of this, I became aware of the burgeoning data, which was first coming out at that time, of the role of depression and anxiety, social isolation, and other factors in terms of the relationship to heart disease. So I began to look at the role of chronic stressors as with its relationship to disease. This ultimately led to the opportunity to put all of this new burgeoning data into a context for physicians. The first major review I wrote was in 1999, published in Circulation, and then in 2005 was able to put another one together for Jack, but the second one began to look at not just the stressors like depression that cause disease, but the opposite side, the positive factors that promote wellness. So this was an evolution of my own understanding and thinking. And during that time, things developed, and eventually I came up with a health model that was completely evidence-based, which was published in JACC in 2014. And this basically said, look, there are a bunch of factors, all evidence-based, that fall into these 6 categories, which would be in terms of physical factors, your mindsets, your emotions, your social life, your sense of purpose, and how you manage stress. And if you do these things well, they promote health and vitality. And if you're suffering from depression or negative mindsets or being lonely, these things cause disease. So it's not just physical factors, it's a lot of biobehavioral factors. And this has been fascinating to me. So a criteria we've used for this all along has been the following. If something is disease promoting, you have evidence. And that evidence is it disturbs the pathophysiology, it causes chronic disease, and it reduces longevity, and there's a dose-response relationship to it. Now, what we did here is, one second here, just doesn't malfunction. I had to get that off. Thank you. In terms of depression, if you look at the evidence-based, hundreds of articles which show that when people are depressed, they have an increase in cortisol and norepinephrine, And this causes a wide variety of, peripheral effects in terms of autonomic dysfunction, increased insulin resistance, a threefold increase in diabetes in depressed patients, central obesity, multiple platelet abnormalities, inflammation, ovarian dysfunction, etc. So really, literally, the body falls apart in people who are chronically depressed. And there's a wide variety and depth of data that show that. There are now multiple meta-analyses which show that there's a very large effect size among people who are depressed in terms of risk for the development of coronary disease, cardiac events, and reduction in longevity. And very importantly, there is this dose-response relationship. So here is a large number of post-MI patients who were studied for follow-up after measurement of depression at the time of onset of follow-up. And they used the Beck Depression Inventory, and under a score of 5 is normal. And you see this dose-response relationship. The greater the amount of depressive symptoms, the greater the decrease in survival. But notably, even at low levels of depression, there was already a significant increase in events. So that's very notable data and has also been shown in repeated study. So the conclusion from all of this on an evidence base is we are built to be happy. And when we're not happy, when we're sad, when we're depressed, it affects our health as well as our sense of well-being. Now we come back to this concept of burnout. We have these 3 criteria. We have the scale that's been developed. And we have to ask ourselves, how does it stand in terms of an evidence base? Do we have evidence that it disturbs pathophysiology? Almost no studies have really been performed. Do we know that it causes disease and decreases longevity? Well, there's been less than 5 or 6 studies published all together in 30 years, which have tried to link burnout to decreased longevity. Those data is suggestive in those studies, but it's far from an evidence base. And we have no data that shows a dose-response relationship. So on top of that, there's this article that just was published, a very important meta-analysis in JACC, 182 studies on burnout. A lot of studies involving a lot of physicians over many countries. And very disturbingly, there was a striking heterogeneity in the prevalence of burnout in these studies, ranging from 0% to over 80%. So what is it? How frequently really is it? And this wide heterogeneity really precluded any analysis of demographic correlates in the study. So in an editorial that was written about this article just a couple weeks ago, Dr. Swank wrote the following: the strong overlap of burnout with major depressive disorder, a more strongly criterion-based clinical diagnosis deserves much more attention. Clinical depressive disorders have more solid grounding, much more so, methods of measurement, pathophysiological foundations, and empirically proven approaches to treatment of varying levels of severity. So in other words, spot on. We are talking about burnout as a syndrome, as an epidemic, lots of programs put into let's decrease physician burnout. And what we don't really know, is it really an important and valid syndrome? But depression is. And when you look at the studies that have looked at depressive symptoms among medical students, for example, and the meta-analysis among residents, the frequency of depression was nearly 30%, which is a very high number and very concerning. And more importantly, when you look at the second meta-analysis in medical residents, you had multiple different kinds of scales which were used to assess depression, and you can see that the results were relatively consistent. In striking difference to burnout, where you have this wide variety or range of prevalence, here you have a consistency across different scales. So it seems like we do have an important problem here of depressive symptoms and depression among residents, among doctors in general. So this coincides with my own evolution in my interest in behavioral cardiology. I started out looking at the effects of acute stress. It was serpiginous, if you will. I was interested in studying silent ischemia. Then I became interested in looking at the effects of chronic stressors. But for over a decade now, I've been interested in the more important question: what do we do about all of this? How do we really help people and patients to be better? So if you take all of these 6 domains in each of these areas, there are potential targets and ways in which we can help people and ourselves. But today, in relationship to burnout, let's focus on the issue of emotions, negative emotions like depression, and the flip side, positive emotions, okay? And the question I'll point out or ask or specifically say is, yes, we're built to be happy, but how do we get there? And to address that question, I want to introduce a concept that I will term emotional mastery. That's a term that's been used in literature, but I would submit that these are the 3 criteria that we ought to be thinking about when we talk about it. Number 1, are the majority of your moods generally positive or negative in nature? 2, when you're down and out, are you masterful at decreasing the length of a negative mood? And thirdly, when you're in a negative mood, how well do you tolerate that mood? To that end, I want to give you 5 foundational principles and tools with each of them. Number 1, don't chase happiness. Number 2, the concept of injecting positivity into your life. The 3rd, which I'll call let it be. The 4th, the tool of reframing. And 5, the importance of managing your energy. Let's go through each one of these, starting with don't chase happiness. So I'm showing you a guy here who's weightlifting, and you can see his expression. What is this guy feeling while he's weightlifting? What's he feeling? Pain. He's feeling pain. So that would be the answer, and I put his pain and crossed it out intentionally because he's feeling pain, there's no question. But he's also having pleasure, and his pain is his pleasure at this point in time. You know, even though he's doing this, this is not a distressed guy who's down and out, okay? So this sounds, a little simplistic, but really there are 2 different classes, systems, if you will, of pleasure. There's a kind of hedonic pleasure that, things we pursue, we eat, going out to hiking, all of these things are very important. But it's a different kind of pleasure that has nothing to do with the expression of your face or the intensity of the effort that you put in. And in fact, there's a whole theoretical literature that goes way back, but actually you can go all the way back to biblical times. And you can see there's this concept of 2 different worlds of pleasure. One we would call more hedonistic pleasure. These are the pursuit of, pursuit of pleasures per se. But the nature of these pleasures is no matter what you do, any physically pursued pleasure is transient in nature. And then there's another concept that Aristotle in his days, in the time of the Greeks, called eudaimonia. The daemon is a Greek word for yourself. You meaning, you're really pursuing what yourself is wanting, which is a sense of meaning. And the concept here is the concept of the pursuit of meaning itself is producing pleasure as a byproduct of the pursuit of the meaning. And there's a literature that has evolved over the last 40, 50 years, very profound, very clear, that in addition to our basic physical needs, the fact that we need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to drink, we have basic psychological needs. And the theorists, debate what are they exactly, but there's a bunch that they all agree with in terms of a need for meaning, a need for growth, a need to be socially connected to others. And importantly, these needs are like physical needs, but we don't think of it in that way because we have this need for meaning that when it's met, when we're really feeling, we're doing meaningful things, it produces a sense of vitality in us. And when unmet, it produces a loss of vitality. And over the last 15 years, talking about an evidence base, there have been articles which have come out, like this study, a group of community dwellers. They looked at the reported level of sense of purpose in their lives. They followed them for accumulated death. And those who had a low level of reported pleasure had substantially more events over that time. And even though this literature is recent, it accumulated quickly and allowed us a few years ago to do a meta-analysis, which I did with Chirag Bavisi from a fellow graduated last year, and Randy Cohen. And this was a summary of 10 studies. And the data was highly consistent that people who had a low level of purpose had a substantially increased risk for cardiovascular events and all-cause mortality. So really in this system, what you see is that we need to pursue meaning, we need to have goals. As we're pursuing, as we're putting the effort, happiness isn't something we chase, but it's a natural byproduct of what we pursue. And the important principle here is the greater the clarity of the purpose, the more you're clear on why you're pursuing what you're doing. If you don't get lost about it, the greater the pleasure you're going to have with the effort that you put into that. So there's a link between clarity of purpose and the pleasure you have with the effort. So this is prescriptive because it means that A, we have to have meaningful goals. Two, as all the good books, all the self-help books all say, they're all in common, we need mission statements. It's not something corny. It's something we need to think about why we're doing what we're doing. And thirdly, that we have to develop what I call as a mission consciousness, that, it's not just something you write out and then forget about, but you have to bring this into your life and, make it an anchor that you're thinking about. And if you do so, you will have a greater sense of vitality. So that's, number one here. Number two, the concept of injecting positivity. So I showed here, I just listed a whole different, types of positive, mindset states, being compassionate, feeling a sense of gratitude, cheerful, optimistic. Among these, two stick out. When we look at mindsets, which is another very exciting field now in behavioral medicine and making its way into behavioral cardiology, what we're clear is that we've studied negative mindsets for quite a while now, actually. Factors like hostility, anger, and the old days type A behavior, worry, rumination, and there's a good literature on all of these studies. But when it comes to the opposite, the positive mindsets, there's been virtually no studies, except for one domain, which is optimism. And it's very fascinating because optimism is an area that we recognize in life that people do extremely well with. And the data over the last 10, 15 years, again, has been profound. That people are optimistic, live longer, they have less heart disease, less non-cardiovascular disease, less respiratory illnesses. They recover from illnesses better and faster. They tolerate surgery better. So it's quite profound. The only problem is that, it's kind of vague. How do you turn a pessimist into an optimist? We're not so clear on that. So here's something that's powerful, but we don't have the proper handle on how to help people. But there's another positive, mindful state that it's clear how to help people, has not been studied anywhere nearly as much as optimism, but I think is a very powerful state. That's gratitude. Now, the investigators who've done the most work on this is Dr. Robert Emmons and Dr. Michael McCullough, and they've done a series of careful studies where they've taken volunteers and they've randomized them into groups designed to produce a state of gratitude versus not. So here's an example I quote exactly from the methods. That they're telling the volunteers, we want you to focus for a moment on benefits or gifts that you've received in your life. These gifts could be simple everyday pleasures, people in your life, personal strengths or talents, moments of natural beauty, or gestures of kindness from others. And they asked them to savor these gifts and to write them down each night for a number of weeks. The control groups were either told to write about their daily hassles or in ways that they were better off than other people. Okay, so they had three groups. And what they found decidedly was that the people who were assigned to the gratitude intervention actually reported, exercising more regularly, fewer symptoms, felt better, were more optimistic, and they also reported a greater sense of enthusiasm and feeling energetic. There are other data that show that, people who are in a more grateful state tend to have a bigger sense of context and perspective in life. It helps to crowd out negative feelings. You're less likely to complain. And although it doesn't have a strong evidence base, it seems to be health promoting. So how do we get there? So we have to make an important differentiation here because everybody, when you talk to them, says, oh yeah, of course, it's good to be grateful. And everyone will say, I want to be more grateful, but how do you really get there? So here we have to make a critical distinction between what I'd say is momentary gratitude and sustained gratitude. Momentary gratitude comes easy to us. Someone's extended to us a kindness, gave us a gift, we had an unexpected gain. After a loss or adversity, even about how the day after you recovered from a cold, you're so grateful in those hours after it finally cleared. Many moments of gratitude that we experience. But sustained gratitude is you've gotten there when gratitude is part of your background conversation. It's one of your mindsets. I'm walking around with a sense of gratitude, okay? So how do you develop that? So the first thing is, you can't just hear this as a euphemism or something interesting. Nothing that you want to pursue, that you want to gain, that you don't have, you can gain without truly valuing it, without seeing it clearly, saying, I want to be that kind of person. And if you do, then you have to build the muscles, just like you have to work out physically, you have to work out psychologically if you want to build in that area. Gratitude is interesting because it's one area you can't multitask while you're doing it. You can't be on the computer talking to people and saying, I'm going to have grateful thoughts at the same time. You've got to stop what you're doing and feel it, okay? So what's about specifics? What are tools? How do you do it? So gratitude lists and journals is number one. You know, that's what everyone recommends in that field. So, you know, when you keep a list, when you keep a diary, it helps you to look and ponder, you know, things you see in your daily life that you can think about in terms of to be grateful for. It brings, you know, your thoughts about it to life. And brings you to reflect on it and the meaning behind it. You know, so like everything else, if you make this rote, if it's not meaningful for you, it really won't work. But if it's meaningful for you, it's a very useful tool. The second thing you can take on are acts of gratitude. Just to put some examples here, you could say, I'll thank 3 people a day, or I'll stop complaining for 1 month, you know, or, you know, I'll share thoughts about gratitude with 1 person per day, or you could have any number of factors. But the concept here is that our feelings follow our actions. So you may not feel it, but if you take on the action and you committed to it, the feelings will follow. The third is you can, you know, form what we call an implementation intention. This is a very valuable tool in psychology, very well validated. And it's the concept of when it is X, I will do Y, where X is something that is in your environment. It could be a stimulus in time or place or situation. And you're saying, I'm taking this out of my head, but I'll let that cue me to do what I want to do. So for example, you could say, every time I have to wait at the elevator, I will recall 3 things to be grateful for. Or you could say, when I wake up in the morning, that's my cue. I will say, you know, thank you. I woke up, that I'm feeling good, you know. So there's many things you could do, but that's the concept of implementation intention. The most powerful one is finding an accountability partner, finding someone that you will share, and they'll hold you accountable and you hold them accountable. I started this with my daughter about 3 weeks ago. We're 3 weeks into it. So ask me after a while how it's going. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it's easier if you have someone to do it with. And just as an anecdote, there's this book written by Janice Kaplan. Now, Janice Kaplan is a known author, so she had an in, if you will, and she decided she was going to keep a gratitude journal for a year, and she had the pre-thought that at the end of the year, she would write about her experiences. So talk about, you know, making it very mindful. She achieved that. So she starts her book by saying, my desire to live gratefully started on New Year's Eve at a few minutes before midnight, when I stood at a party clutching a glass of champagne with a plastic smile pasted on my face. I know I should be counting my blessings, but instead I was counting the minutes until I could leave. But how does she finish her book? And it's a great read, the book. It's really interesting. She, you know, interviewed a lot of experts all along the way and provides their insights. She says, you know what? Living gratefully, it started out as a lark, and once I decided to write a book, the year-long project could have slipped into being just a literary device. But as the year went on, the project had lodged deeper and deeper into my heart and soul. I wasn't just reporting, I was also feeling. Something changed in me. Gratitude affected how I looked at every event that happened. Being positive and looking for the good had become second nature, and that had made me much happier. So that's what's available to each of us if we'll take this on. So that's the second technique. The third technique, and this is the one that's going to be a little hard to explain, only because really what I'm about to say deserves an hour in its own right, because it's experiential, but I'm going to try to take it on anyway. And it's the concept of let it be. So what do I mean here? So a question for you. I want you to each for about 30 seconds, 20 seconds maybe, try to be angry. As you sit there, try to be angry. Anyone succeed? Okay. Well, okay. I mean, I could do it. But you can't get angry unless how are you going to get angry? By thinking angry thoughts. Unless you can't generate it without the thought to drive the feeling. And that's psychology 101. That, our emotions follow from the thoughts we have. So that means that better thoughts can lead to better feelings. And if you can change your thoughts, you can change your feelings. I'm saying something extremely obvious. But right after having said it, it's not so simple. Because really the relationship between thoughts and emotions is bidirectional. The minute, someone has upset me, the following thoughts are going to be going downwards. It could be a negative spiral. So really it's bidirectional. But it's even more complicated because, our thoughts lead to behaviors which affect our thoughts, and our emotions do as well. So our behaviors affect our thoughts and emotions, vice versa. So you end up with these interrelationships, and this is the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the most powerful, I think, at least evidence-based psychological intervention that there is out there. Very strongly evidence-based. And it looks at the present. It doesn't go into, your past this or that, but it's looking at your thoughts, your emotions, your behaviors, and what can we change that, if we change one aspect of this, the others will follow, okay? But there's another thing we have to add to psychological 101, which is the fact that we also have moods. And moods are important. What are moods? Moods are, if you will, background feelings that persist for some time relative to emotions. They're generally less intense than emotions, but they can be quite severe, like a person who's depressed. That's a very severe and very difficult mood. But also, moods aren't as readily identified in terms of cause and effect, and the reason is because they're multifactorial in origin. I'm going to get a little bit more into that soon. But here's again, Psychology 108. As our moods go down, generally speaking, not necessarily so, but generally speaking, our thinking goes south with it. We develop more negative thinking when we're in a more negative mood. So, we're at our best when in high moods, and we're at our worst when we're low moods. What do I mean by that? So when in a high mood, we have what we tend to be in more expanded consciousness. We tend to be more creative, more attentive, have more broad perspective, more spontaneous, more flexible. We feel a good sense of vitality. And on the other hand, when we're in our very low moods, we tend to have what we could call constrictive consciousness. We become more preoccupied and self-centered. Our creativity escapes us. We become more inefficient. And importantly, we develop often when in a negative mood a sense of urgency to really get out of that mood. We just don't like being in negative moods. No one does. So this leads to three important correlates here. One is what I'd call the seduction of low moods. What do I mean by that? So it's exactly as I say, that when in a low mood, we have this pull to want to get out of it. We have the sense of urgency. And paradoxically, this is when we most want to solve problems. When we're in this low mood, we want to figure it out, talk it out, but we're not at our best. So really, there's a concept of, hey, wait, let it be. You have to use a cognitive override to say, maybe I shouldn't trust my thinking so much when I'm in a low mood. But even though we can understand it intellectually, in the heat of the moment, we forget that. We tend to, be very concrete about the feelings and thoughts we're having when we're in a low mood. So that leads to a higher understanding of something we could call thought metacognition, or the thoughts that we have about our thoughts, because we do have thoughts about the thoughts we're having, okay? So I can best describe this through a case scenario. So could have been any case, could be a young doctor too. I said, Joe is a young attorney, this is hypothetical. A partner has placed upon him a new assignment unexpectedly, and Joe at that moment has the following reaction. I can't believe he's assigning me this. I already have so much to do this week. I'm feeling so time pressured. I will never get this all done. What a miserable week. This is the thought process Joe's having, a very, very common scenario. Now, if we could put a thought-o-meter, which doesn't exist yet, who knows, on Joe at that time in his head, and we are looking at how he's relating to his thought. At one end, we could say that, my thoughts represent reality. At the other end would be understanding, hey, even though I'm having this thought, it's just a thought I'm having. I could have other thoughts. It's just an interpretation I'm having at the moment. If you would take this most concretely, those who think, their thoughts are just the thoughts, that the bear is really there in the closet, that would be very abnormal. That would be a psychotic, if you will. Really, what's the more healthy end, the more flexible end, is to see my thoughts are just my thoughts, okay? So let's apply this to Joe. Let's say Joe is one of those guys at the far end who tends to see his thoughts as being reality, okay? So Joe, at the time he's having a thought, will feel definitely time-pressed. His mood will likely be diminished because of the thoughts he's having and he's generating, and he's likely to charge it up because as he's having this and he runs into his friends or colleagues or spouse, whatever, he's going to share his thoughts and feelings and maybe even react what the partner said to him, maybe add further spice to it. This is what would be a classic thought attack. On the other hand, if Joe realizes, hey, wait, this is my reaction, but you know what? It's one way to look at it. The minute that you understand that your thought isn't necessarily reality, it's just a reaction you're having, it gives you choice in the matter. You have an opportunity to say, this doesn't necessarily have to ruin my day. They are potentially, this is where I'm responding, but at least to understand there's alternative cognitive responses. So really, when you look at this and you say, where do people stand on this? Very few people really feel that their thoughts are reality, but actually more people tend to be more like people who generally take their thinking as reality and not questioning what I'm thinking. Maybe this is what I'm feeling, but I'm thinking, but I don't have to trust it. Maybe there can be other ways. Maybe I'm in a low mood and right now I'm not seeing it clearly, but when I'm in a high mood, I'll see it differently. So let it be. But a healthier person, one who's, let's say, had this more emotional mastery, would be more toward B. And this is where we want to get to. We want to get from A to B. We want to make that part of our repertoire, part of our toolkit, if you will. To do that, we need to bring in a third concept called thought recognition. Very important concept. So here, we're constantly thinking, we know that. We can't help but think, okay? But the majority of our thoughts escape our awareness, and that's a good thing. You don't want to, when you're driving, every time to think exactly what you have to do. The minute you learn driving, it became automatic and it freed you up to do other things, okay? But this is not a problem in the positive mood state or positive thought state, but when we are negative states, we can get caught up in our negative thoughts without being aware. And one thought can lead to another, like a runaway train, and you're not even aware that you're doing this to yourself. And I call this getting caught up in your drama. But if you can catch yourself in that process, it gives you choice in the matter. So let's come back to Joe. And let's say, ready as a review. If he's the type of guy who sees his thoughts as reality, his mood is going to be diminished. He may tend to share his feelings and thoughts with others and charge it up. On the other hand, if he's at the other end of the spectrum, he has a chance to respond in a different way and even to choose to ignore his thinking. The problem is the majority of our thinking is non-conscious, and that's a good thing in many ways. However, the challenge is that this whole thinking process and the ability to have this thought metacognition is generally something that escapes us because most of our thinking is non-conscious. So let's bring this down to Joe. So Joe is feeling time-pressed. He's feeling charged. He's saying, I have so much to do. His mood goes down. That's when we feel an urgency to solve the problem, okay? So Joe thinks, okay, what am I going to do? Maybe I'll defer X, Y, and Z to next week or the week after. Maybe I'll delegate this to somebody else. Maybe I'll go and complain to the boss. The problem is he wants to solve the problem even more urgently because he's in a low mood. But the problem we've said is don't trust your thinking so much when you're in a low mood. Doesn't mean you can't solve the problem, but think twice about it. You're not at your best at the moment, okay? So there's a third alternative. which is you don't have to solve the problem. You can say, just let it be. Oh yeah, this me feeling uptight again when someone puts a demand on me. And right now I'm really annoyed by it, but you can let it be. You don't have to necessarily, if it's charging you up at that moment, respond to it, okay? So what's the value of being able to catch yourself in your thinking? If you're in the middle of charging up your thoughts, it stops the drama. Just recognizing that you're doing this decreases the charge of the feeling you're having. You're also less likely to say, hey, I got to reenact this with other people. And you're less likely to act in the face of a low mood and wait for your mood to arise. It gives you that ability to do that, okay? Let me give you a personal scenario to illustrate this further, because this is what happened to me this week. I was working on this Grand Round talk Monday night. Really, I should have worked on it last week or the week before. Voila, this is what happens. Monday night, I'm giving Grand Rounds on Thursday. But on the other hand, I'd looked forward to this because I really wanted to put this talk together. I wanted to talk about burnout. Monday night, I was feeling, oh gosh, I waited too long. I was feeling too time pressed. I had a lot to do. I was particularly tired Monday night. And I realized I might not be able to put this talk together the way I envisioned. So this is what was going on. And as I was doing this, recalling the feelings I was having, definitely my thinking was spiraling at that point. I was thinking, why did I leave this till the last minute? You know what? I should have spoken on nuclear cardiology. That would have been really easy. And I said, I talked down at Morristown about 2 months ago. I gave a very nice talk on cardiac stress testing, put a lot of new stuff together, a lot of our data. That would have been very suitable. Okay, so these were the things I was feeling. Okay. Now, at that point, I was going into problem solving because that's what we do. We go from one to the other. And I said, hey, wait a second. I gave a talk to the fellows 2 weeks ago on stress management. I got some feedback after it. They seemed to like the talk. One fellow actually texted me that maybe I should give this talk to Whiter, to like the house staff. But I said to myself, because I caught myself, and I worked with this concept. I said, you know what? Let's just see how I feel tomorrow. Okay? And I said, let it go. And you know what? When I woke up on Tuesday, I said, I can get this done. I've had these ideas for a while. I'm going to put the talk together. It's a great opportunity to put this together, and I let it go. So it's, the concept of let it be. And, let it be, I can't help it. I'm an old Beatles fan and whatever. So I happened to think afterwards, let's go back to the song. And it was amazing because it's a very beautiful song. It's one of the more famous songs. And I couldn't believe it. You look at the words of the song, it's the whole concept of what I'm talking about. It just happens to be. So strong. So when I find myself in times of trouble and says, let it be, whisper words of wisdom, let it be. It's one of the more powerful tools you have available to you to short circuit a negative thought attack and negative emotions. This brings us up to the last two areas. One, reframing. Now, reframing builds off of what I've just said. Now, what's reframing? Reframing is taking a negative thought pattern and, reframing it in a positive way. So there's this book, it was first popularized by Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking. I don't submit to that. And in fact, if you take a depressed person and you tell them, think positive thoughts, they'll look at you really, or they might be very angry because you can't just do it. You just can't turn around your thinking at will. And yet you can. So what's the way you do it? You have to come in through the back door. So number one, there's 3 steps to being able to successfully reframe. Reframing is at the core of cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's at the core of what's available to all of us. It's a thing we should all be able to do and use in our lives all the time. The first part of that is what I've just said. We have to recognize that our thoughts are just our thoughts, that they are interpretations. They don't represent reality. Once you understand that, it's like loosening the soil. Now, once you do that, you can say, okay, whatever I'm feeling or thinking, I could generate alternative thoughts to it. And so that's the second step in reframing. Let's just try and say, hey, what? This is bothering me. Is there another way to look at this? Okay. So a person actually came to me. He was 37 years old. He'd been recently married. And he was upset. And he was upset because his father, who he was extremely close to, had gotten a job in a foreign embassy, which meant he was going to be leaving the United States for 3 to 4 years. And this was a particularly close-knit family. He had an unmarried sister who was still living at home. And he, as I said, was just recently married, and they were extremely close. And this was really bothering him a lot. I had worked with him a little bit on the concept of reframing. He was interested in behavioral cardiology. And I said, okay, reframe this. Come up with alternatives. And he came up with 3. He said, you know, 1, I can look at it from my dad's point of view. The kids are grown, and this is my ideal job. I only live once, and the job won't be forever anyway. So that was 1 reframe. Number 2, I'll be okay. Mom promises to come back every 2 months, and the time will pass by quickly enough, and then my dad will be back. And number 3 was, I'm 37 and married, recently married. I'm planning to start a family, and this is an opportunity to get closer to my yours. And my sister needs to grow up a little bit, and this will be good for her. She'll mature more. So that was step 2. Step 3 is that you have to make the alternative thoughts, they have to be credible. If they're not credible, they're just an exercise. So I call this like, you know, try to shoot the ball in the basket. You know, like if you're playing basketball, you have a sense that that ball is going to go in the basket. You know, you hit it well. And it's the same with your thoughts. This thought rang true with me. So I said to this person, okay, of those thoughts, which rings, you know, true for you? And he said, really, the first 2 are, you know, rationalizations, but the third really does speak to me. I do need to, you know, let go a little bit, get closer to my wife, and my sister does need to grow up. And he felt good about that. And he said this was like a positive way to deal with it. And he came back to me later and he said, you know what? I really feel better because I saw that I was able to take a negative frame of mind and turn it into a positive frame of mind by this process of reframing. So this is what this person accomplished. So reframing, you need to practice. You have to start with the little things. And a very good tip is to find a good mentor, someone who's wiser, older, more objective, knowledgeable. Share what you're feeling. Let them show you potential reframes. And if you do this regularly, you'll get very good at it. The final point is the concept of managing your energy. Very important. So there's a person named Robert there, actually he's no longer alive, but he did very incredible work in the 1970s, and he wrote a whole series of books on his works, very good reads. And the nature of his research was that he would take volunteers, they wore beepers, and they would be randomly beeped during the course of the day. And when they did what beep, they had to record their activities, their energy level, their tension level, and their moods. And, you know, from this, he noted a pattern where he could divide people into, you know, times when they felt high energy or low energy, high tension, low tension. So you ended up with 4 subgroups, if you will, or 4 types of situations: calm energy, calm tiredness, tense energy, tense tiredness. And what he found was that when people were either in a state of calm energy or calm tiredness, they had very few low moods. They were generally in positive mood states. They had very positive coping behaviors. They felt good or they felt mellow. It was a very good situation. When they were tense and tired, they felt moody, they felt down, they felt the need to escape. These people wanted to get out of their sense of tense tiredness. That's when people were more likely to smoke cigarettes, to eat the chocolate, to watch the, escape movies and things like that. And it was very profoundly obvious that tense tiredness was not being tolerated well by people, which left this state of tense energy. So when you looked at the people who have intense energy, what do you think? Did they look more like people with calm energy, or did they look more like the people with tense tiredness? How many think they look more like the people with calm energy? One person. How many think they look more like the people with tense tiredness? Okay, most of you. Well, indeed, they look more like the people with calm energy and calm tiredness. Actually, we're doing pretty well, okay? And what this tells you is, you know what? Energy trumps tension. As long as we feel energetic, we handle the stress in our lives pretty well. But when we're down and out, and when we feel tense and down and out, we don't handle that well, okay? So this is very profound because, first of all, it shows you that your moods aren't just psychological, they're biopsychological. And your sense of, even your sense of tiredness is going to affect your moods in a great way. And this, by the way, gives us further proof But we're not at our best when our low moods, because that's when he found where people looking at all the quick fix behaviors and the bad behaviors, drinking more, smoking more, and so forth. It tells you that energy management is an important part of stress and emotional management, and that factors such as exercise, diets, naps, and sleep can be highly prescriptive in helping people to deal with their moods. And in fact, there's a wealth of data which shows that people who exercise well feel less stressed, less anxious, less depressed, etc. And you can use it as a tool. In fact, he did a study. I like this very much. He took 18 volunteers and he exercised them at 4 different times, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, each time in the morning and afternoon when they'd had a candy bar, and in the other times after they did a 10-minute brisk walk. And what he found with all 4 times, whether you had a candy bar or you exercised, you had an increase in your energy. So, both work to increase your energy. But when he looked at the attention and he looked at over 2 hours, he found, the people who exercised 2 hours later were reporting lower levels of tension. But those who had a candy bar 2 hours later were reporting higher levels of tension. So the candy bar is the quick fix. And we're tired, we say, we can't exercise. But if you use cognitive override and say, yes, you can, you're actually going to have the same energy fix and you're going to feel better afterwards. And I'll point out, I actually wrote an editorial on this, a profound number of studies that show that, in cross-sectional communities, cohorts, those who exercise have less depression. And when you study people longitudinally over time, people exercise develop less depression. And importantly, randomized trials have been done which show that exercise is as effective as antidepressant medication for treating depression. This is data from my good friend James Blumenthal at Duke. We randomized 101 patients with depression into 3 subgroups. One group exercised for 4 months, another received sertraline, and another were put on placebo. And the exercise was at least as effective, if you will, as the antidepressant in modifying and decreasing depressive symptoms. So, in conclusion, we are built to be happy. It's our natural default state. Happiness is power. It provides, as we understand, with power, with vitality, improved quality of living, improved health, and more longevity. 5 core approaches toward improving happiness have been reviewed here today. Don't chase happiness, pursue meaning, pursue gratitude, learn to let it be, learn how to reframe, and manage your energy. When you do all of these things, you develop more emotional mastery, you'll have more positive moods, you'll be able to short-circuit negative moods and tolerate them better. And I think if we do this, we'll all be on the way to decreasing the widespread problem of Dr. Burnout. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much, Alan. Norma is away today at a conference, so I'm going to take her place in the first question.
That's good.
I really want to thank you because this clearly shows that you don't have to be at the mercy of events around us. We have the ability to step back, look at it, and assess our situation in a rational way. I do have a question. As I was listening to this, I kept thinking, what philosopher most influenced this talk? And so I'm going to put the question to you. You mentioned Aristotle, and I don't think it was Aristotle that really framed this talk, but is there a philosopher who influenced you in putting together this talk? Frankly, when I heard this, I thought of Montaigne.
Well, there's a whole bunch of people who've influenced my talk. I'm very close to a specific rabbi, too, that interested in psychology and showed me like a lot of spiritual aspects that influenced me. But I'll tell you, the first person who influenced me was when I was starting this work on mental stress. This, we think of life as coincidental, but then we understand the Almighty is moving things along. And I really believe I was meant to go in this direction. And as I was getting into this project looking at the effects of acute stress, I walked into a bookstore and I see this red book called The Healing Heart. And I was attracted to it. I picked it up, and it was a book by Norman Cousins. Norman Cousins was a very famous editor and philanthropist, and he'd written a book in the 1970s called The Anatomy of an Illness, using how he used humor and so forth to respond to a kind of rheumatologic disease, and was improved and cured. And then he had a heart attack a number of years later, and he talked about his response to that and how he used positive emotions to do that. So I'm reading the book, and I say, whoa, he's an adjunct professor at UCLA. And so I said, maybe I can go meet with him. So I called his office, and I landed a meeting with him. And I told him about the research I wanted to do, and he actually gave me on the spot the initial funding I needed to do the project I showed. But we started a relationship. I, started talking with him, and he was an amazingly sincere person in his understanding of the role of positive emotions. And he started moving me in that direction. And then many people moved me. I was part of the MacArthur doing my 2-year sabbatical, and I met like 40, 50 different people. Actually, I was on different campuses. And I continue to read a lot of self-help books and talk to people, and a lot of people move me.
Thank you, Al. It's very topical, and really appreciate all the thought you put into it. I think we're all impressed you got this put together between Monday and Thursday.
Me too.
And you just think about my patients living in the rare disease world, my HPS patients. The most common mutation is HPS1, and those patients know that somewhere between 95 and 100% of them develop pulmonary fibrosis sometime between the age of 20 and 50. And the longer I've worked with that population, the more I've come to feel that I understand the power of anxiety, and more that I feel a sense of utility in terms of helping them with that anxiety. I feel like I'm much better about appreciating it, no matter what they're talking to me about when they come to see me, but also that I really don't have a good way to help them through it, because it's the reality of their life, and it's the reality of their genetic disease. And I just wondered if you might comment on that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's a very famous book written by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. Of course, he survived the death camps of the Nazis, but he was a psychiatrist, and he was looking to understand who was surviving and not. And he understood that those who found a sense of meaning in the experience were the ones who survived. And he wrote profound insights about how we, pursue things on our own and inject, meaning into it, but eventually, for all of us, life will call upon us to respond to it. And the only way to survive is through a sense of meaning. And he actually writes in his book that, about the concept of people getting sick, and that's analogous, and that the way to deal with it is to find a sense of meaning in the experience. None of us want to be tested in that, but we all will be, and that is the root. It's the first of the 5 things I talked about, in terms of meaning. Meaning is the only way, you see the organization MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Who founded that? Women who lost their children to drunk drivers, killed. The only way they could respond and survive in a healthy way was to make that now a cause to help others with it. So the tool for helping these people, it's an individual journey for each, is somehow to find a sense of meaning, in the suffering. Now, we don't say that to them, but we help them along in the process. And that is the greatest sense of what a physician's all about, being a healer. Bernie Lown, a very famous cardiologist, who understood the relationship between the mind and psyche. It's really interesting how many cardiologists over the years have had this relationship between the head and the mind. He writes in his books about this very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I bring a comment from Roosevelt?
Sure.
I enjoyed your talk very much, but I have one thing to say about it. One of the ways you can practice recognizing that you have thoughts, and your thoughts aren't reality, is meditation. Almost any type of meditation, whether it's mantra meditation, concentration meditation, meditation on sound, all of them, you're concentrating or you're thinking, and you recognize this practice every day, and recognize that you have thoughts, and if these thoughts come, if they're spontaneous, and you don't really have control of what comes into your head. So consciousness is the generation of thoughts. And I think that it would be wise if that were mentioned as one of the techniques that you can use to improve health, happiness, and in general, your entire mood is to meditate, because it allows you to recognize that these thoughts are out of your control. You have to let them go, and you're much happier when you can recognize your thoughts at the earliest stage. And when you do that, you find that your level of consciousness actually transcends. You are recognizing your thoughts, and then for a while, you're out of your own situation. And it's an experience that can be reliably obtained through several different kinds of meditation. Transcendental meditation is one, meditation on concentration is another, but these methods are ancient, and there's a lot of evidence that they work.
Thank you for that important point and insight. I absolutely agree with what you said. And it reminds me, as you said, that there's a woman, Barbara Fredrickson, who is down at University of North Carolina. She's done a lot of work in this area, and she talks about the value of a kindness meditation, where you direct the meditation toward a given area. And I'd say that with gratitude, you could do the same thing as well. You could turn the gratitude into meditation, which probably would amplify it as a technique, now that I think about that. Thank you. Thank you all.